Hello, welcome to Gardener's World. This is a variety of pea called Hurst Greenshaft. And they are a really good pea. They're not too tall, they're fairly low, heavy cropping, reliable, and of course, fresh peas, completely delicious. And I'm not the only one who's been enjoying the peas, because the sparrows this year seem to have an extra hunger on them. They've been descending on the peas in flocks. And as well as them, we've had pigeons eating the brassicas. The rabbits have come in and have decimated the French beans, reduced them to a stub. The blackbirds have been gorging on the raspberries. But I can't say I mind that much, because there's plenty left over for us, and all that wildlife adds a richness to the garden. On today's programme, garden historian Adverley Richmond discovers that there's more to a Staffordshire theme park than its roller coaster rides.
The last time I was here, the pagoda fountain was covered in tarpaulin, so I've never seen it in action. Oh my goodness!
Nick is on the second part of his South African adventure, glorying in the dramatic display of Crocosmia growing in its native habitat.
When you see the plant growing in the wild on a scale like this, you can see why it's become so popular.
And if you've been growing tomatoes along with me, I'll lead you through the next stage, and I'll also be summer pruning my espalier pears. Come on. This way. Patty, come on. Now, the reason why I'm wearing this intensely flattering Teletubby outfit is because it's time to do a little bit of maintenance in the pond. We made this pond 8 years ago, and it's really had very little attention. I leave it for months on end, which is not necessarily the best thing to do. If you want a pond to look as good as possible, then you do need to garden it, just like any other aspect of the garden. Now, that means getting in there. Now, this is always the interesting moment. The chances of me disappearing under the water with all the grace of a ballet dancing hippopotamus are quite high. Good so far. Right, straight away, you can see here these browning leaves that look as though they've been blasted by a blowtorch. Something terrible has happened to them. Well, it's called time. This is Caltha palustris, the kingcup, marsh marigold. It's done its flowering, it's over, these are dying back, and in fact there are new leaves in there, so I need to cut that back. I'll reduce these old leaves. So this new growth here has got plenty of vigour to it, is nice and fresh and green, and that will produce these great big yellow buttercup flowers in April and early May. This is Iris pseudochorus, lovely yellow flowers. But it is a bit of a thug. Where it's happy, it can take over. And the only solution is to ruthlessly cull it. So just take it out like that, and that's ready for transplanting to the other pond if I want. So we'll put this to the side here. And that can come out there. These will grow in boggy conditions or submerged under the water. So I just plunge them into the edge on a relatively shallow part of the pond. I don't try and secure them in any way, and the roots grow and attach and are completely happy. So that can go to one side. Now, what I want to do is use this rake just to rake the water a little bit to pull any dead leaves. And a rubber rake is ideal for this. And what you're really after, as well as actual dead leaves, is weed, blanket weed or any surface weed that you get on the water, because if that covers the sunlight, then plants below the water are not getting enough. And the reason why you get blanket weed or algae growing is the relationship between nitrogen in the water, which you get from decaying leaves, and sunlight. And it grows very fast. It's a really efficient plant. So what you need to do is to take out as many of the dead leaves to deadhead, take off the spent flowers and the spent leaves, and don't let them fall into the water. And that will reduce the nitrogen content, and also make sure that the plants you want are covering at least half the pond. And all this sort of matter needs to be put on the side like that, so any little creatures can get back in the water. Ever since we got this pond, almost from the next day, it has been a complete delight. And I would say to anybody, if you don't have a pond in your garden, make one. Big enough for a few plants and will be a magnet for wildlife. For those of us who love to visit gardens and always find some inspiration that you can bring back to your own garden and apply, it's good news that more and more are opening up and we can get out and about much more. But visiting gardens is not a modern phenomenon. And Adderley Richmond has been to visit the garden of one of our best-known theme parks.
In recent weeks, Alton Towers has been a little quieter than normal. It's usually more like this. But although the rides are recent, this park is well used to visitors, because long before the roller coasters, it was the gardens that brought the thrills, all due to one rebel. In the 1800s, the eccentric and very wealthy Charles Talbot, 15th Earl of Shrewsbury, decided that he needed a project. So he set out to create an unusual and extravagant garden from scratch. Charles was so rich and such a maverick, he chose this deep, dry valley for its construction and threw everything at it. He planted trees. He diverted streams. He dug lakes and reservoirs, all to create a world garden stuffed full of features from all around the globe. In 1811, when Charles embarked on his project, Britain was in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars and not sure who she was anymore. So the gardens were a celebration of British history with a nod to other nations too. There's an orangery over there, and just above it is the tip of a Stonehenge meets Aztec monument. But over the other side of the valley is a Swiss cottage. And inside the house lived a blind harpist whose tunes rippled down the valley to add an air of mystery. The garden is all about surprises and views, with glimpses of the next feature through the trees, luring you to explore. A key feature is the 300-foot Grand Conservatory, a tribute to classical Georgian architecture and recently restored. As a historian, I have seen quite a few garden conservatories in my time, but this has got to be one of the best examples. It is absolutely gorgeous. These rooms would have been packed to the gunnels with new and exotic plants. set within Charles's meticulous design, and all to delight his guests. And these superb pineapple finials were a symbol of hospitality and friendship, which is why we still see them on gateposts today. A rotunda sits next to the conservatory with a handy grotto underneath, and below that an Italianate colonnade celebrating Greek mythology, with the muses and a few gods thrown in for good measure. Most people at that time would not have been very well travelled at all, so they had guidebooks to explain to them exactly what they were looking at. It's just as well as next to it is Le Refuge, a French section with plunge pool and changing rooms. So why have a pool, colonnade, grotto and a conservatory all within a stone's throw? Because he could. Each area would have had elaborate planting to match, so although topiary had fallen out of fashion, Charles, in his usual manner, put some in anyway. He didn't want only one yew arch. He wanted 9. This whole valley is covered in paths. Fat ones, thin ones, steep ones, and many disappearing into the trees. It was partly to add to the entertainment, but also to cope with the sheer number of visitors. By the end of the 1800s, up to 30,000 people a day came for big events. And even in the 1930s, it was still going strong. Charles had created what was essentially a theme park, now with donkeys and hordes of people admiring the features and the water that pours through the garden. The fountains were, and still are, gravity-fed by a reservoir built 2 miles away and channeled by the lake's pipes and rills. And this is the key to the main fountain. And I think it looks just like the key from a corned beef tin, but on a bigger scale. The last time I was here, the pagoda fountain was covered in tarpaulin, and the water hadn't run for almost a decade, so I've never seen it in action. Oh my goodness! Oh, wow! Oh my word, this is amazing! Absolutely incredible! The colours are so vibrant. These beautiful golden bells. It's just absolutely astonishing. The famous and very eminent Victorian garden designer John Loudon was rude about the pagoda and the garden, saying it was brash and uncouth, but there was history. Charles had consulted Loudon about his pagoda and then completely ignored everything he said, so I think it was a case of handbags at dawn. There are more features, of course, like the man-made cave and the Aztec-like Stonehenge. And as the valley made it impossible to see the house from the garden, Charles built a prospect tower. This was designed so that visitors had a view of all the main features. The Swiss cottage, the house, the colonnade, the yew hedge, even the conservatory. On Charles's memorial, there's reference to what he did to this dry valley. It says he made the desert smile. He certainly did. And for me, who needs a roller coaster when you've got a garden like this? 200 years later, it's still so amazing.
I think that's such an interesting insight into the Victorian period, this idea of the garden as entertainment, as a theme park, and almost limitless wealth to create it. Now, these basil plants, I sowed these just 2 weeks ago. You can see that they've germinated, and now they're developing tiny true leaves, and that means they are ready to be pricked out. And the key thing about basil is to grow individual plants that are strong and healthy. I'm going to put them into plugs, so I will put compost in there. Now, basil is a plant that does well in a rich soil, so treat it well from the very beginning. Can you hear the swallows? These are the young swallows nesting. I feel completely privileged that they've chosen to nest in the tool shed. So if you hold them by a leaf and gradually lever them out like that, you can see that's got a perfectly good root system, and I can pot that up. And then pop it in here like that, firm it in. And this means that they're now not competing with each other for nutrients. And when the plugs are full of root, but not root bound, I can then plant them out directly. Basil is a herb that responds very well to heat. So if you're growing them at this stage of summer, the nights will be warm. So these can be planted out probably in about 4 weeks' time, and then they can grow on into late summer and even early autumn. But they are not hardy, and if you have the slightest touch of frost, basil are the canary in the mine, because they are always the first plant to be blackened by frost. Now, over the years, I've always paired basil and tomato, and there are 2 reasons for this. Because wherever you get basil growing successfully, or even tomatoes growing successfully, the other will thrive too. But also, basil keeps whitefly away from tomatoes. And growing specific plants together like this to support and help each other is called companion planting. And we've been sent a film by Joe Hunt and her son Finley from Newcastle, who took on an allotment at the beginning of this year. And from the outset, they've applied the principles and rules of companion planting to huge effect.
Hi, I'm Jo.
Hi, I'm Finley.
And this is our allotment.
We secured this allotment in January 2020 in a quite weathered and overgrown state.
So since we got our allotment, we decided to try companion planting. Nasturtiums are a great companion plant for all sorts of veg, from broccoli to cucumbers, cabbage to pumpkins, and peas to beans. So when you dot them around the garden, they not only act as a brilliant burst of colour, but they also attract the creepy crawlies, and if they're not too badly damaged, you can actually harvest it and put it in a salad. We've also planted mint beside our carrots, and the smell of the mint confuses the carrot fly, so hopefully these will stay pest free.
These are the tomatoes.
And we have marigolds planted beside our tomatoes. So the marigolds give off a secretion through their roots, and that stops any creepy crawlies. But it's important that the marigold and the tomato are planted in the same growing material. So whether pot or directly in the ground, it's a good idea to nestle them beside each other.
This garden is as ecologically friendly as possible, and that will further support all the efforts made with companion planting. And it also means that there's less reliance on any man-made pesticides.
Bye.
Well, I think Joe and Finley have made a terrific job, and it does show that you really do not need to use chemicals to control the pests and have a healthy and productive garden. And when you think they only took that allotment on this January, they have done a fine job. Now, the three sisters that I've got here are pretty fine too. I'm very happy with them. Of course, three sisters are the combination of sweet corn, courgettes, which are growing out here, haven't given me any fruit yet, but they will very soon, and beans. These are French beans that are flowering profusely. You've got tiny little pods already beginning to appear. The courgettes and the beans will be productive over the next week or two if we get a bit of sunshine. And the sweet corn, which are flowering, will produce the cobs round about 4 to 6 weeks' time. So it's a good combination. And this is the bed of the Gardener's Delight tomatoes that I sowed on the 1st of May. And if you sowed some then too, yours should be about this sort of size. These are cordon tomatoes and are grown up a single stem. And you can see there's little fruit, little green fruit beginning to form. And these will develop quite quickly and ripen quickly too if we get some sunshine. But also the plants will grow at the same time and get heavier, so they must be supported. And that means tying them in regularly. And you'll need to keep doing this. Don't let them flop, but tie each one in. And if you do it once a week, that means that they don't kink or bend and run the risk of breaking. And tomatoes are actually surprisingly hardy. You think of them as greenhouse plants, and the fruit certainly ripen better in a greenhouse. But the plant will grow well outside in a normal British summer, if there is such a thing nowadays. I also like to feed them weekly. And at this time of year, as they're starting to form trusses, feed once a week. Now you can buy proprietary tomato feed that's very good. You can make your own comfrey feed or use seaweed, liquid seaweed, which I do a lot too. But they are all high in potash, which is what they need to help them form fruits. What you don't want is lots of lush growth and no fruit. But you can also mulch around them at this stage to give them a feed. And if you've got plenty of comfrey plants, and if you have any comfrey plants, the chances are you'll have plenty because they grow very strongly and fast. It doesn't take a lot to make a liquid feed, so you're going to have excess. And what I do is just take the plants, chop them up. You don't need to strip off the leaves or anything. Just chop them up a bit so you've got a selection like that and lay them round each individual plant. The comfrey will biodegrade very fast, and as it does so, the goodness is worked into the soil and the tomato plant will take it up. And this will coincide with the continued appearance of more and more fruits. Now, if we get some sunshine, they will ripen quickly, and I would expect in a couple or 3 weeks' time to be harvesting those delicious, quite small, but absolutely lovely little tomatoes. Now, I'm growing my tomatoes outdoors in a raised bed, but I know that many of you will grow yours very successfully in containers, and that for a lot of people, containers are their garden. And this is a good moment to revisit a garden down in Kent because it combines a generous outdoor space with a large amount of containers that are more than just an adornment. They are the very heart and soul of the garden.
Seeing the colours dance Every day, this garden makes me smile. I had a friend once who was always saying, Annie, you wear too much black. And then suddenly, I've just gone into colour. It lifts you. It's about a vibrancy of life. My name is Annie Warner. I knew from a very early age the importance of being surrounded by greenery, being immersed in plants. In my garden, I have 3 terraces. I have 150 pots. I love this feeling of things erupting out. I've got geraniums, cosmos, marguerites, but planted into the soil, I have got euonymus, pachysandra, and ivies to make a sort of ground cover. Evergreen, whether it's the ivy or the euonymus, grows up and sort of surrounds my pots and makes them part of the earth, so that you don't know where one begins and the other ends. And I love it that some of my pots I can't even see anymore. I haven't seen them for a couple of years, even longer, because they're now encased with ivy. It makes them feel part of the ground. I wanted the vibrancy of bright pinks, bright oranges, reds of different hues, because of the vibrational quality of it that I love. It merges with the green, they spark each other off. This is the first time I've had hanging baskets, and I love that feeling of flower and tendrils draping, falling down, meeting other plants coming up. 2 different worlds sort of merging together. I think of it as my living painting. It moves from season to season. The colours change because I might think, oh, that colour's not working quite right there, so I'll move the pot. To water this garden, because there is a lot of watering to go on, I have a watering system, but it's a drip irrigation system, so water is not wasted. You are using water very economically. I've always been fascinated by paths. It's something about the mystery of where do things go. I wanted to make an area that was slightly mysterious. So I set it like a stage with an arch. I wanted to introduce the helichrysums into the lanterns so that, again, you've got movement. So it's my little area for sitting quietly contemplating life. The colour green is, I feel, an essential part of my life. A number of years ago, I got terribly ill. I was under an immense amount of stress, and I looked out at my garden, and the phrase that went through my brain was, you cut yourself off from this at your peril. And it still goes through me, you know. I know it is an essential part of my life. And I think the other great thing about gardening is it's a step into the future. You are taking a step into your future life, because if you're planting things, you have to be there to care for them. It's something that takes you forward. It's just a wonderful space. It feeds me every single day. For me, it's wonderful.
I do so agree that we need to connect with that outside world. And the one thing I guess we've all learnt this year from our gardens is that we need them as much as they need us. It really is a two-way process. Now, I do grow a lot of things in pots, and most of them are because they're either beautiful pots or I want to use them as highlights and to create arrangements. But sometimes I find I have to grow things in containers to make them grow successfully at all. This is true for agapanthus, because agapanthus are one of those plants They grow much better if their roots are constrained. Now, if you've got very chalky soil or very stony soil, that's fine. You can plant them straight out, and they should flower and grow well. But if, like me, you have rich clay loam, what will happen is the roots will just grow out into them. You'll have a mass of lush foliage and very few, if any, flowers at all. So by growing them in thinner soil with lots of grit in a pot, that's when you get lots of flowers. Now, I have to confess that these ones here are not a result of my horticultural skill. These were bought because I just like the look of them. The ones that I grow myself are coming later. They're slower to flower, and I have two different types. There are the herbaceous ones, which have much finer, grassier foliage, which, being herbaceous, dies back in autumn. Now, they are hardier, and I keep these in a cold frame. But actually, if it's not too cold where you are, they can stay outside in the garden. But the evergreen types, which have a richer, often fatter, thicker foliage, and of course evergreen, is not so frost hardy. So I keep these in the greenhouse. And I feed them seaweed once a week, but the idea is to put the food into flowers, not foliage. And I would expect in about 3 weeks' time these to really hit their stride. Now, still to come on today's programme. There's another chance to enjoy a beautiful garden of carefully curated colour that has been nurtured for over 40 years by a dedicated husband and wife team. But first, we're going to Bristol to join Hazel Trapnell and the communal gardens attached to the block of flats where she lives, because it has taken on huge significance in these strange times that we've been living through.
Welcome to Hazelwood Court in Bristol. I'm Hazel. There are 32 flats here with plenty of lawn. Sadly, we residents are often like ships that pass in the night. But ironically, since lockdown, doors have opened up. Some of us have discovered gardening and each other.
I've made quite a lot of friends, really, I feel now. Lots of people who gave advice about the plants and shared ideas. So the whole experience has been fantastic.
The overall size of our plot is 7 metres by 10. And it was a mess. We needed to do something with it, so we decided to redesign and start again. We divided the plot into 6 mini allotments. Complete beginners, starting from scratch with no money, we shared seeds and seedlings and asked questions.
Being a newcomer to Hazelwood Court, I just felt pretty isolated, and helped me get to know lots of people. And yeah, it's made me feel a whole lot happier here, really.
It's definitely been a challenging, quite stressful time work-wise, so it's been nice to come out at the end of the day and do a bit of watering and have a different focus that's not just being inside my 4 walls.
I have the joy of seeing people come together, of community developing, making new friends, but also just growing vegetables. But I think I have the extra joy of feeling that it's all quite a miracle that it happened in the timing that it did.
I think Hazel's experience is something we can all relate to, because although we may not have shared a space with other people and been confined to our own gardens, there has been a sense that this is something that we've all done together, and that communal spirit is really powerful. Now, a plant that is powering its way here in the Jewel Garden is Crocosmia lucifer. These brilliant vermilion flowers shine out for weeks on end, and when the flowers are over, the seed heads are really decorative and stay looking good well into autumn. Now, ever since it was first introduced, it has been a star in almost all our gardens. But it originates from South Africa, and Nick went to South Africa to see Crocosmia growing in its true home.
rich, diverse landscapes of South Africa are home to over 20,000 species of plants, including some of the most spectacular. Back in the 1990s, I spent a year living and working in South Africa. I fell in love with the people, the landscapes, but above all, the incredible array of plants. Now, I've come back to Mpumalanga in the northeast to seek out a plant that's a firm favourite with UK gardeners, the Crocosmia. A member of the Iridaceae or iris family, the name Crocosmia comes from the Greek word krokos, meaning saffron, and osme, meaning scent, as the dried flowers produce a strong smell of saffron when placed in warm water. There are 9 species of Crocosmia in the world, 7 of which are native to South Africa. And when you see the native plant growing in the wild on a scale like this, you can see why it's become so popular. Here at the Valoran Valley Nature Reserve, the tallest, most vigorous species grow in vast swathes. Perhaps one of our most iconic UK border plants is Crocosmia lucifer. It has those incredible red bird-beak-looking flowers. Well, here is one of its parents. This is Crocosmia paniculata, growing out in the wild. And you can see the sheer scale of it and the fact that these broad bladed leaves carry through to lucifer and give it that real strong characteristic in the garden. What's really lovely about both the parent and lucifer is their incredibly long flowering. And being here and seeing them in the wild can give us real clues as to how to grow them in the UK. Here it's on a relatively free-draining soil, but it gets a lot of rainfall. So during the summer, it needs to be quite damp to keep it flowering well. However, in the winter, it wants to be a bit drier. So you don't want a claggy clay soil. You want something that's a bit free-draining, but with a bit of organic matter, so it holds it well in the summer. And in fact, if you look after it well, you can get about 2 months of flower from it. And then once that's finished, you get the lovely seed pods through the winter. Now, most of us don't have the space to create a swathe of this scale, but by dotting a few through your borders, you can get a really dramatic look at those bright red, lovely flowers. Professor Craig Peter is a botanist at Rhodes University and has a special interest in plant pollination. The cultivar we grow in the UK, lucifer, is pollinated by a range of different insects. But I understand here there's a real specialist that pollinates these.
Yeah, so if you look at these remarkable long tubular flowers, they accommodate the long curved beak of a malachite sunbird, which is pretty much the exclusive legitimate pollinator.
Okay.
So as the bird probes into the flower, the pollen gets deposited up on the forehead of the bird.
Perfect. So the nectar's the reward for it pollinating. I noticed some of the individual flowers are sort of torn apart right at the base of the flower. What's causing that?
Yes, because there is so much nectar in this landscape, lots and lots of other birds are drawn to the area. Not being able to reach the nectar, the only option is to pull the flowers apart.
So this is a landscape of sugar that's feeding all of these different creatures?
It really is. There's a huge amount of energy resources that all sorts of animals, particularly birds, will come to exploit.
Can we eat it?
Of course. Nectar is just sugar water. And as I said, these flowers have...
It's literally dripping out.
Huge volumes, and it's really delicious.
Have a try. Wow, that's really good. Sort of like a light honey.
Yeah.
Really lovely.
Yeah.
It's just fields of energy.
It's quite a bonanza.
You know, South Africa is full of surprises. You can be walking down a lane and suddenly, kapow, look at this. This amazing plant is called Brunsvigia, and it's in the Amaryllidaceae family, so it's closely related to those big amaryllis that we grow at Christmas, except it's 10 times the size. What's even more special is these giant paddle leaves it has at the base. They initially appear to be smooth, but if you touch the surface, they're very coarse, which must protect them from being eaten by the native fauna. What an amazing plant. Crocosmia grow in a wide range of habitats in South Africa. A few hours south of Mpumalanga, the open grasslands at the Highveld give way to the rolling hills and mist-belt forests of the Natal Midlands. These indigenous woodlands are home to a host of beautiful South African species, like this little Streptocarpus, just growing away here by the path edge. They're also home to a Crocosmia that thrives in the dappled shade of the woodland canopy. And here it is, Crocosmia aurea, sparkling away on the edge of woodland here. There's a stream down below me, and it's loving these damp conditions. Now, of course, the reason it's called aurea, it's part of the botanical name of the plant, and it means gold, and you can really see that with those stunning tones. What's especially useful about this plant is that it's a parent of most of the cultivars that we grow in the UK. So crossed with Potsii, it's produced some of our most spectacular cultivars. So the likes of Sulphitaire, Emily Mackenzie, and Star of the East are all as a result of this little beauty. Now, it's quite different to Paniculata in terms of its foliage. It's really quite smooth and silky. Comes up to about 60 or 70 centimetres high, and left to its own devices, it'll produce quite a substantial clump in the garden. Now, depending on the cultivar, they can go for up to 3 months of fantastic successions of blooms aloft these lovely silky leaves. But if you want to propagate it or share it, it's just as easy as dealing with any other perennial. So in spring or in autumn, you can use a fork or a spade to cut away a piece with a decent amount of root underneath, and then just plant it up in another part of the garden or share it with friends. We have South Africa to thank for a huge range of the plants that we grow in our gardens. And it's been brilliant to come here and see Crocosmia paniculata and Crocosmia aurea, because of course they're the parents of the very best cultivars we grow in the UK.
Come on. I'd never seen the Crocosmia growing like that, and didn't they look amazing? Absolutely fantastic. Now, this is the perfect point of the year for summer pruning. Summer pruning is ideal for any kind of fruit that is trained into a certain shape. That could be espaliers like this, it could be cordons or fans, and it's a way of keeping its shape, because summer pruning, as opposed to winter pruning, curtails growth. If I did this in winter, it would stimulate it with even more vigorous growth. That's why you summer prune. Now, these are Bon Chrétien pears, and when you're pruning back and you've got new growth like this won't produce any fruit this year, next year, and maybe not even the year after, because the fruit is produced on older wood. So I need to prune back to the old wood that we've got there, and I can just take that a leaf or so above. You can see here that these are old wood with spurs, and the spurs are what will carry the fruit. And then there's slightly younger wood there, but still old enough to carry fruit spurs. And then we come to the new wood. And this is all new up here. So what I'm doing is cutting back so there's just a little bit of new wood left. If I cut there, like that, I have just a stub of new wood. Now, in time, that will ripen and be more productive and give a fruit spur. And you can tell if there's going to be fruit next year because it'll be slightly swollen under the spur. As we go along, we can work back, and then the next phase, when you have cut back, is just to work out the structure. So we've got 3 layers, 1, 2, 3. And each one of them has got these side shoots coming off them that will carry the fruit. And the beauty of this system is that the smallest garden can have lots of fruit. You can grow them as cordons, as fans, as espaliers, as stepovers, and they all need summer pruning. These 2 rows of espalier pears divide the cottage garden. And all around it, we have an easy jumble of pastel shades. And if you can control colours and limit them, that's very often a good creative basis of a beautiful garden. And that certainly was the case when we went to Staffordshire to visit the garden of Margaret and Peter Hargreaves.
We moved into the cottage in 1975. It was solely a lawn with an apple tree.
I do the planting because Peter just won't touch that, but I don't want him to anyway because I like to do it.
I like to keep it tidy. Mowing the lawn, deadhead.
You're only allowed to have the push mower, aren't you? We don't have electric mowers in this garden. Otherwise, he'd be mowing all my flowers up. Colour is the main thing. Immediately, I started colour scheming the garden. It gave me an extra dimension to my gardening. The soil was my palette, and I was painting on it. I think every garden should draw you in. And my garden, I wanted the colour to draw you into it. This bed, I've planted it in pastels and then going to dark and then back again, so that it flows through the border. And this is my peach, whites and blues. It's a little bit more of a tricky bed to do because it's difficult to get hold of peach flowers. The hotbed, I had to have it because I love the red flowers. This chocolate dahlia called Karma chocolate. And then, of course, I have lots of lilies. My lilies stay in for the whole time, and I always make sure that in the autumn I feed them with bone meal. This is planted in mauves, purples and silvers. It's important to use height in the garden so that the garden tears down. I'm very keen on foliage. It makes a nice backdrop to the plants. I've discovered with eryngiums that you must plant them at the front of the border, otherwise they'll just die on you or they won't flower at all. I call them unsociable. They must be on their own and have plenty of space. The thalictrums I particularly like. You can put it at the back of the border and you can also have it at the front of the border because you can see through it. And I think that gives it rather a sexy look. When we moved here, I was delighted because I inherited black, loamy, rich soil. I would take muck and fling it all over the borders. And I think this is what's given it its initial start. And this is why the plants look particularly healthy and grow to quite a high height. It's just sheer love. Gardening definitely comes with experience. The more you do of it, the more you learn about it. I can be out here 12 hours a day, but it never bothers me. I just enjoy every minute of it. It never seems like a chore to me, and it does reward us very well.
I do think that the combination of Margaret's eye and Peter's care and tending for the garden has created something that looks to be really special. But you don't necessarily need that sophistication or degree of control over colour to get an effect. If you have a rough colour guide, that drives the planting in a border. So these borders are predominantly pink and purple. And I want to add some plants that pick up those colours and themes. And this is an echinacea. It's Echinacea bravado. These are daisy flowers with big open petals and the cone centre that butterflies and bees absolutely adore. They come into flower in August and then go on through into September. The downside of Echinacea is that they can be very short-lived. And you can buy them and plant them, they look fantastic the first year and maybe even the second year. And you come to look for them in the third year and they've gone. They've disappeared completely. Now, the convention is that the ideal conditions for them are wet in summer and dry in winter. Well, certainly here at Longmeadow and over most of the country, you get exactly the opposite conditions. And it's the wet winter that does for them. They can rot. But they are proving to be a little hardier and tougher than people might have thought, so it's worth persevering with them. And especially if, as I've done here, you grow them from seed. These were sown about a year ago, and they spent the winter in a cold frame in plugs. They've grown slowly. You can see that there's a root system there, but it's still a fairly small one. And there is one huge advantage. Although it's slow, and although it means I haven't got the instant hit of a bigger plant, because they're grown from seed using our soil as part of the compost mix, they may well adapt to this garden better. And the other thing is, the price of a packet of seed gives me 20 plants or more, which means that if I lose them after 3 years, it's not the end of the world. Now, I'm planting them in groups fairly near the front of the border because these will grow to be about no more than 3 foot tall. There we go. Now, I'm not certain that these will flower this summer, but if they grow slowly at their own pace and you get decent foliage, which then dies back over winter and returns next spring to make a nice, healthy plant which flowers well next summer, I'll regard that as success, because some things are worth waiting for. Now, all the gardens that would otherwise have opened their doors this spring and summer, and there are thousands of them right across the country, of course haven't been able to, and we haven't been able to go and visit them. But we have been given privileged access, and here is the garden of Jackie and Pete Ager in Worcestershire. So relax and enjoy the simple sights and sounds of their garden. I do think that we all get so busy with the process of horticulture that sometimes we forget just to stop. Now, I've been busy in here, actually. This is very much part of the engine room of Longmeadow, and at this time of year, where I grow cucumbers and gherkins. So I grow them in pots which are half full of garden compost, and then bring them in here where it's not only hot, it's fairly moist too, and I water them very thoroughly. And you can see they're growing very well indeed. This is a variety called Burpless Tasty Green, and we've already got quite a few on here. I'm often asked how you know when a cucumber is ready for harvesting. Well, as good a guide as any is to look at the end. You can see if you've got a small one like this, it's got a much more pointed end to it, compared to this one here, which is much more rounded. This is absolutely ready, and I will certainly harvest that today. On this side, I've got gherkins growing. Now, gherkins essentially are a form of cucumbers, of small cucumbers. And you can see that I planted these out on the 26th of June, and already I've got good fruit. And these are plenty big enough. In fact, you can harvest gherkins any size you want. And the secret of gherkins is just keep harvesting, and they will produce more fruit. But you grow them in exactly the same way. Lots of heat, lots of water, and plenty of feed, and they will go on pumping out those delicious little gherkins. Now, I need to cut this back and try and tame it a little bit. So that's a job I need to get on with. And while I'm doing this, here are some jobs for you this weekend. If you're growing your tomatoes along with me, now's the time when you need to regularly pinch out the side shoots. These are the strong growths of 45 degrees between the main upright stem and the leaves. Mediterranean herbs like this sage have now finished flowering and are setting seed. So it's a good time to give them a trim. This will stop the plants getting straggly and provide fresh leaves, which are much nicer to use in the kitchen. It's not too late to sow some late flowering annuals like calendula and cornflowers. And as well as adding late colour to your borders, this will give insects pollen and nectar to feed on over the coming months. If gardeners are honest with themselves, they spend most of their time trying to control nature, to make plants do exactly what they want, when they want it, how they want it, and where they want it. But sometimes nature fights back and wins. And the long walk is a good example, because the Alchemilla mollis was planted to edge the path. But it's grown long and lush and has flopped over the path and is now just flowing along the length of it. And the Acanthus spinosus, planted well back, not least because it's very prickly, and also because we wanted these upright spires of flower in between the box, has leaned in and is doing its own thing. And the result is much better than anything I could have designed. But that's it for today. I'll be back here at Longmeadow at 8 o'clock next Friday. So until then, bye-bye.